As the last chapter of the Verdite Trilogy comes to a close, I feel quite bittersweet knowing that this will be the last mainline Kingsfield entry that I'll ever cover. Having already covered Kingsfield 4 in the past, and while there are other games like Shadow Tower, Eternal Ring, and Kingsfield Additional 1 and 2, this is still the end of early Kingsfield as we know it. Maybe not the complete end of early FromSoft, but surely the end of its infancy, as Kingsfield 3 demonstrates a significant improvement in game design and optimization over its predecessors. It's an impressive sequel and a satisfying conclusion to what's been built up by the previous two entries. This is going to be a pretty comprehensive overview of Kingsfield 3, everything it does well, everything it does poorly, so if that devalues a first playthrough for you, I highly encourage you to play Kingsfield 3 blind. Even as a first-timer in the series, it's far more accessible than the previous two, and it's a hell of a lot of fun.
Kingsfield 3, much like the previous entry, is misnumbered internationally because the original never saw a release outside of Japan, but since there is only one Kingsfield 3, unlike there being both two Kingsfield 1s and 2s, there should be far less confusion on what game is actually being talked about. Kingsfield 3 released in Japan on June 21st, 1996, having roughly an 11-month gap between the release of Kingsfield 2, 4 months longer than its predecessor's development time. Not only was more time and care put into Kingsfield 3, but its developers had a better understanding of the PS1 hardware and game design in general after the work on the previous two entries. You can see this not only in the better visuals, but the series has never ran smoother and less janky than Kingsfield 3. Kingsfield 2 was a nightmare of poorly optimized environments and scuffed hitboxes, and I think it was a learning experience for the developers, since Kingsfield 3 seems to improve on almost every flaw the second suffered from. The game also does well to tie together the story of the first two and offers consistent plot development throughout the game, rather than mostly just an opener and epilogue. Yes, Kingsfield 2 was a proper story, but it leaves much to be desired in terms of actual plot in the middle stretch of the game, where it feels like you're not making much progress until suddenly you're facing Necron and Gyro all at once. The manual summarizes the events of both Kingsfield 1 and 2, how Alfred ventured into the royal catacombs and claimed the Holy Moonlight Sword, and when Alexander Thronton Reginus of Granatki then recovered it from the cursed Isle of Melnot. It also mentions Vallad, a great god who created both Seath and Gyra but was unable to control or put a stop to them, thus causing the events of the previous games. After Alexander Thronton Reginus of Granatki returned with a Moonlight Sword and Darkslayer, peace and prosperity returned to Verdite for another 5 years, until the fateful anniversary of Gyra's demise, where a violent storm raged over Verdite Castle and the king fell mysteriously ill. King Alfred emerged from his chamber as a changed man. Demons began to ravage his kingdom, and all he did was watch and bask in the chaos. Alexander, getting word of the trouble, rushed to meet back with his old friend, only to discover an empty stair as cold as ice, and the Moonlight Sword shattered to pieces. Unable to purify the king, his only option is to seal the entire castle away with a powerful magic barrier. Its only key divided amongst the 4 strongest mages spread across the land. When Alexander finishes the barrier, he traps Alfred inside, alongside of many innocent soldiers and servants sacrificed for the greater good, then falls exhausted on a small hill, never to awaken again. We all learn this from a letter that Alexander Thronton wrote to give to Leon, our caretaker, as our father fell mysteriously ill 10 years ago, and it's our duty to put an end to his accursed reign as Prince Lyle Forrester. Kingsfield 3 begins in the town of Quist, with Lyle being given the X-Selector, which is now a simple crystal short sword and will supposedly grow with us along our journey, evolving as Lyle does throughout the lands of Verdite. The opening few areas are nothing iconic or noteworthy, other than the fact that they're great introductory stages for the player and get them acquainted with many Kingsfield mechanics seamlessly. Quist has it all: multiple hidden walls and valuable treasures, a few powerful skeletons that teach the player not to mess around, and a reusable key needed to progress and open many early game doors. Lyle's childhood friends and guardians also reside in this mostly peaceful village, all giving words of encouragement or telling stories about the town. town. Commander Silveria was a brave soldier who aided the people of Quist in walling off the town and other places of Verdite to help quell the flow of monsters across the kingdom. His keys are what we use now to unlock the blockade and venture through the mossy tunnels or long abandoned barracks of the soldiers. The intertwined walls blockading Quist showcase a distant Verdite Castle across the skyline. This is the first instance in the series where a future area is teased and actually shown in the regular game world. A hard thing for a PS1 game primarily taking place within caves and dungeons, not just technical difficulty to pull this off realistically, which is a combination of reasons why this didn't happen in Kingsfield 1 or 2. This is a really cool moment right out the gate of the first town. Kingsfield 3 establishes itself as a proper world. Everything is built in relation to other parts of the map in terms of size and placement. Eventually, when you get a general map, you can already tell that Kingsfield 3's world is much larger than anything up to this point in the series. The island of Melonot was quite vertical and dense, but pretty small in scale, which technically makes sense for an island. It won't take long for you to figure out that the map designers traded off Melonot's intertwining verticality for a far more flatter but larger overworld. Sure, this takes out some of the complexity from Kingsfield 2, where you could easily be lost from the overcomplicated map, but Kingsfield 3 still gets confusing in its large, maze-like dungeons. The sheer scale of things is enough for a player to get overwhelmed or disoriented. The world map also does well to sell a sense of cohesion, where without it, the player might feel like they're pointlessly wandering through a bunch of irrelevant areas until they suddenly make it to Verdite Castle. But with the map in hand, whenever you pop out of a tunnel like the confused, anxious rat that you are, you can actually see where you are in relation to the whole world, and go to all the areas teased throughout the game by the map, including areas you thought you'd never be able to reach because they look so inaccessible or incomprehensible. These are along the right edge of the map, and they are typically cliffs or mountains, but you can go to all of them, and it's a treat to discover the world to be bigger than you initially thought. This is a really good map, as it's also not reliable for the player for navigation, rather it just shows their general place. Now I know that sounds weird, but a big crutch in the first two Kingsfield games was the player getting an all-encompassing and detailed map of most areas they're in really early into the game, which ends up preventing the player from developing a better sense of direction or memorization skills. It was also very confusing or overwhelming, especially in Kingsfield 2, where you're whipped with the largest fucking area you've ever seen, complete with multiple overlapping layers that the player has no idea which way is up or down. It's helpful when you fully explored an area, but ends up making the map overwhelming when just starting out. Now in Kingsfield 3, you do get a more detailed map. Fittingly, after a forest maze, you have to demonstrate your navigation and memorization skills on your own in order to acquire. The game up until this point has been conditioning the player to actually memorize areas firsthand in order to navigate, and when you're accustomed to that exploration, it's much faster and more rewarding than constantly checking a map every 5 seconds to make sure you're going down the right corridor. When you do get the Pixies map, it may seem like it's going to ruin exploration, because in the forest maze, it's another jumbled, confusing mess, much like the Royal Cemetery's map from Kingsfield 1, but quickly after, you realize that the Pixies map doesn't automatically show you everything in a new area. Rather, it just keeps track of where you've already been. I knew the forest maze better firsthand, to the point where looking at the map made it seem more complicated than it actually was, which is another point as to why you shouldn't always rely on a map in these games. But the Pixies map does dodge the pitfalls from previous Kingsfield games by not outright doing the discovery for you. Thus, it doesn't make new areas needlessly complicated, and remains a helpful resource to those who have already intricately explored an area and need a refresher. I hope you enjoyed that 3-minute segment about maps, because we're about to jump into another exciting topic of accessibility. Kingsfield 3 is also the first in the series that allows you to change your controls in-game. Previously, I had to remap them in an emulator, since the button configuration in 1 is swapped because the Japanese think B is A for some reason, and in Kingsfield 2, you normally turn with the D-pad and strafe with the shoulder buttons, which is super awkward since it's not what I'm used to from Kingsfield 4. Obviously, without an emulator, you'd be a little screwed in my situation, since there's no way to remap controls in the base game, and I died a lot in early Kingsfield 1 while I was still figuring out my controls, and remapping them saved me from hours and hours of reconditioning and struggling with the awkward movement. In Kingsfield 3, you can change between many different preset button layouts, and there is one that perfectly fit my preferred way of playing. You also have the option to toggle health bars instead of numbers, something I personally liked more from Kingsfield 1, or the option to make the compass bigger or smaller. Sex Compass is back, by the way, everybody. Rejoice. Nowadays, these options are nothing special, but the controller configuration is especially huge for the King's Shield series and similar games by FromSoftware onwards, where the entire experience can hinge on the controls being actually comprehensible to you. The gameplay itself is practically unchanged from the typical King's Shield formula. You still circle around enemies with a slowly recharging stamina bar, explore a large interconnected map to collect important key items or abilities, and become the King of Fields. Although this time the map is more linear like King's Shield 1's Royal Graveyard, as opposed to Melonot's chaotic and sprawling open-endedness. You typically spend a lot of time completing an area before being able to progress, and thus you're far less likely to miss a large chain of important key items like in King's Shield 2. That isn't to say it's completely devoid of flaws, or that an open-ended map is objectively worse. I just prefer the more curated map design that makes it much harder to miss crucial things, and also aids the game into feeling more like a proper journey. The speed of the game is markedly faster and far less inconsistent than King's Shield 2 especially, and a margin above King's Shield 1 that was still prone to slowdowns with more than a few enemies on screen. You probably know about King's Shield 2's speed issues since I bitched about it for 5 minutes in the previous video, but to reiterate, not even an emulator can save you from the game dipping down to 10 to 15 FPS and slowing to a crawl. It might even exacerbate the issue by running faster than original hardware and creating a larger discrepancy of speed, which made it way less enjoyable to play. I can't speak for the entirety of King's Shield 3 on an authentic PS1, but considering the fact that I ran into slowdown in the previous 2 games somewhat regularly enough to notice, and almost never had an issue with King's Shield 3, the developers definitely did something massive with the model and environment optimization in order for the game to run at a consistent speed. I only noted a single instance of the game slowing down, and it was at a completely random spot that might just have been a game hiccup. I can't even remember where other than it happening, which is how little performance issues King's Shield 3 had for me. As for playing the game on a PS2, since that's all I have, it does run noticeably slower by maybe 5 to 10 FPS than on emulator, but it remains consistent in speed and only marginally slows down when a few enemies are on screen, and they usually skip animation frames in order to save performance. Regularly exploring the world feels about the same as on emulator. Again, I can't speak for the entirety of the game, but it does feel like King's Shield 3 runs significantly better than the rest of the Verdite Trilogy. But that's enough for the technical side of things. At the moment, Lyle resides inside a walled fortress that probably housed Silveria and his militia. The walls buffer between Verdite Castle and the rest of the land, creating a strategic base to defend Quist from monsters over the years. Inside, we find the cursed bones of a former soldier encased in a stone wall, whose old mother pleads with us to save him from his agony. His prison is a heavily darkened segment plagued by creepy, nearly transparent ghosts, the first instance of a fully 2D enemy in a King's Shield game, not to mention the trees we have come across that are just a spinning 2D texture, yet another example of the designers trying to cut back on resources while still making the game look good to try and optimize performance as much as possible. Many models in King's Shield 3 look incredibly good, especially in comparison to the very stiff and blocky enemy designs of King's Shield 1, or its rather plain models for weapons and armor. While NPCs don't always particularly look great, enemies sure do, and all the items, weapons, or armor pieces are well detailed and have a lot of flair to them to make them stand out from the early model work of King's Shield 1 or 2. Sometimes even too much flair in regards to something like a simple iron plate mail or elven shield that are oddly textured, but I still do like the over-detailed approach taken with most of the items and especially the weapons, making each appear unique and powerful even for early game swords. The Tier 3 X Selector is one of my favorite models in the series. The horribly impractical gap in the side of the sword that would probably cause it to shatter in one hit looks so goddamn cool I can disregard how silly it is. And yes, as mentioned before, the X Selector is an evolving weapon that gets stronger as you use it in battle, and even slowly levels up regardless of what weapon you're using, giving you an always reliable weapon at whatever stage of the game you're in, while also not restricting you to just the X Selector. You can experiment with any weapon you like, and there are many options along the journey that are relatively on par with each other. I didn't want to get into the X Selector just yet because, well, Lyle has just started his journey, but it was a natural inclusion. I really like the thematic idea of a character's specialized weapon that evolves and grows in power and versatility as Lyle himself does over the course of King's Shield 3. Anyways, we save someone from eternal torment or whatever, but that doesn't matter much. What does matter is the cyclone of fire that I thought would teleport Lyle straight into the hellish pits of Shadow Tower, but really takes you into the chamber of the Grand Fire Mage, Garanbus. These areas are presumably a sort of pocket dimension or rift and tide held by these powerful wizards until the fateful day of Lyle inheriting their power, afterwards dissipating with little to no energy remaining after the long 10-year wait, leaving the fate of Verdite in Lyle's hands as their mission is complete. These one-off elemental rooms are incredibly cool and stylized, selling the grandiose of the ceremonial power trade-off. There's an underground prison and tunnel system past the fortress that is very unnoteworthy in the scheme of things, other than for its ridiculously long chain of locked doors that require 5 total Silveria's keys, past 2 total hidden walls, and an extra mid-game key to get some lackluster items. A new mechanic is introduced where you can shoot physical contraptions to unlock doors, which I was too stupid to realize for far too long. At this point, Garanbus granted us the gift of fire magic in our first spell, a fireball, which is a staple of the King's Shield series, so it might be possible to shoot down these locks far before obtaining a bow. You may also notice a difference in the magic system of King's Shield 3 in comparison to the rest of the series. Magic is separated into 5 distinct elements, and instead of previously where there was an overarching intelligence stat, your power and proficiency is dictated largely by these individual numbers for each element. There is still a wisdom stat, which I have no idea if it affects magic or not. Verdite gems still exist, which increase each element by 1 instead of your wisdom or intelligence from the previous games. You gain a large burst of elemental stats upon meeting each respective mage, and you can't use an element you haven't unlocked through them yet, obviously. Specific elemental crystals also don't teach you new spells in this game. They are much more common in King's Shield 3, whereas before they were extra special and sometimes well-hidden rewards that were crucial in learning new magic. Now they just increase that respective element stat by 1. I feel like this new system is both good and bad. While I like the idea of splitting each element up separately, and it makes sense thematically, it also makes it harder to level up your overall magic power, and rather will have you specialize in 1 or 2 elements to actually do decent damage. Certain equipment does increase specific elemental affinity to somewhat counteract this problem, but elemental crystals are further devalued by only offering marginal stat improvements rather than a flat upgrade. Sure, they are more plentiful, but they are also less important because of that. Obtaining a magic crystal in King's Shield 2 used to be satisfying because it taught you an entire new spell to mess around with, but now you might need to find 5, 10, maybe more of that specific crystal on top of practicing that element yourself in order to learn just 1 new spell. Because of all this, I didn't end up using magic much throughout King's Shield 3. Not only do you have to ration it out for the first couple of hours in game where it would be the most useful, but afterwards it doesn't feel much more powerful than just hitting your enemy with a sword for free. Late game magic is still cool, but it's pretty expensive and was just something I used for fun rather than an actual effective attack.
Oh, that is dealing damage.
Ascending from the cave, we find the house of an old friend, a bard that has guarded an incredibly important seal of Icarus, legendary artifacts that allow one to teleport to sacred healing fountains.
Lyle, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I was swindled by a fairy many years ago who stole the Eye of Icarus from me.
Stolen, you say? How did you let that?
I didn't mean for that to happen. She tricked me, that's right, and only left me with this stupid block of wood. Please, Prince Lyle, have mercy.
You fucked the fairy, didn't you?
No, Prince Lyle, I would never. You
fucked the fairy.
Take this block of wood and don't kill me, please.
With the Staff of Varde in hand, a cylindrical object that looks absolutely nothing like a staff, it allows us to utilize a unique mechanic to the upcoming forest maze of switching paths by raising or lowering certain stumps that block the way. This is the same forest maze mentioned before during the map segment. While it's not very large, it is quite dense and offers many different paths at the same time that cause it to be a bit slow to fully explore in depth. It lies both adjacent to the town of Ralugo, a larger and slightly more eerie settlement due to its red sky and lava river, and the ancient temple of wind guarded by some leaf-loving elf that won't let you through without some level of wind magic. What a tool. How does he expect me to get wind magic and save Verdite if I can't even get into the wind temple? Anyways, Varde is somewhere in this forest who supposedly took the Eye of Icarus to keep it safer, who was impossible for this bard to find after many years of searching, and oh hi Varde. Oh Lyle, you're finally here. Yeah, I was told by that bard that he lost the Eye of Icarus and yeah, that idiot fucked the fairy. I knew I had to steal it from him if the ancient forces of evil were to be kept away from it long enough. Here you go. Thanks. Utilizing the Eye of Icarus takes us to one of the many ancient holy restorative fountains created by Icarus, a descendant of the High Elves who inherited their vast knowledge and magical powers, and thus was able to create marvels of engineering and magic to bless the lands of Verdite. His blood runs through the Forester lineage, which is what allowed John Alfred to use magic. As with Lyle, it's imperative that we obtain all 3 seals of Icarus and bring them back to Lyon, to create an important key and unlock the potential within them. Lyon is the last remaining person with this knowledge and expertise. The seals of Icarus are our only form of fast travel and easy navigation through Verdite. While there are a few shortcuts throughout the land, they are few and far between, but the map is condensed enough to where warping to a single fountain shortens what would otherwise be a 15-minute backtrack into a couple minutes long one. The Eye in particular takes us back to Ralugo once again, possibly hinting that we have unfinished business within this depressing town. One man describes the hopelessness and despair that pervades the kingdom, and how over the years people have begun to lose faith in ever seeing the light of peace, even growing to hate the king. This is reinforced by a villager carving a grave who, recognizing us as Prince Lyle, tells us to piss off and beguile someone else with your forked tongue. Well, we can't blame anyone for disliking us after all these years. Other townspeople include yet another shirtless dude ravaging a piece of food like Soup Man from King's Field 2. He mentions a sick child we need to help with specialized medicine, topping it off with, "I'm very busy. Go away and quit dashing the few remaining hopes your people have if you're not going to help." What a nice guy. I sure hope he secretly isn't important for anything later down the line, because he's really busy scarfing down bread and surely doesn't even look employed. The child in question looks like he has more trouble than sickness with his wicked messed up proportions. We'll get to him soon. Across from their house is the home of... Seriously? Are the localizers taking the piss here? The house of Mark Johnson. Ah yes, the mystical ancient elf scholar with all the knowledge of the universe who can divine the intricate history and purpose of your various magical items you're too stupid to figure out, was decidedly given the most American-sounding name like he hits home runs for the Verdite varmints every Saturday. As a side note, it appears that at least a few of the names of NPCs in this game come directly from the H-Tech localizers that worked on it. This includes Mark Johnson himself, Lyn, who we'll see right after this. Even Commander Silveria gets his name from the H-Tech localization team. I've been pronouncing Silviera wrong this entire time and refuse to change it, because I have too much pride. No, it's the H-Tech localizers who are wrong, because Silveria is obviously a much cooler elf-sounding name. Next we have, a nice elf lady that sells us some important provisions away from home. The only merchant since departing from Quist so far. Her name is Lyn Reinhardt, who may be distantly related to the old King Reinhardt from King's Field 1, but that's just speculation. She's really important to the plot for different reasons, as we see her throughout the game, who's actually one of Lyle's childhood friends and attempts to help him along the journey. And finally, in a tunnel linking to an important path ahead, we have a "Go away, imposter, I'm the real Prince Austin Lyle Forrester." Right, let's just leave him be. Let's walk away, slowly. I can hear the voice of a lad singing to me. I can disintegrate this wall with a mere candle. I can move the earth with a flick of my fingers. The Light family treasure will be mine. Schizo Forrester only shuffles out of the way once we help the sick child, so I guess I'm going to need empathy for one time in my life. Don't worry though, giving him the herb makes his proportions even more fucked up and he'll never live another normal day of his life. Be sure not to get within 5 feet of the cliff you need to pass, otherwise you'll be gravitationally pulled into the lava pit, because in King's Field 3, the real hardest enemy is the will of insta-kill pits to edge you off, force you inside them, thrust you from behind, forget it. As payment for irrevocably ruining his life by shrinking his legs, the child gives us a wind crystal so he can boast the door guard of the wind temple that we have exactly 1 point in wind magic, so he technically has to let us through. Yeah, That's right, buddy. Move aside. Here resides creepy xenomorphs, many fire pillars we need to light in order to steal the mage's treasure, and some reused wall enemies from King's Field 2, the same kind that hurl massive homing fireballs that could easily one-shot you. Oh dear god, it's coming right for us. Oh. While the projectile tracking on these enemies remains unforgiving with the slow movement speed of King's Field, they're not entirely impossible to outrun and deal far less damage, even taking into consideration how early we are into the game, roughly only dealing 1/6 of your health bar, which might equate to 20 to 30 damage. And it only hits you a single time. Crazy how much they dialed back on the projectiles in King's Field 3, almost like it was a massive problem in the previous game. But I am the wrongest man on YouTube, so don't take it from me. Take it from software. Sorry for my snarkicism, because I do concede I was being a bit too exaggerated with my combat issues of King's Field 2, but I wanted to demonstrate the attention to proper game balancing the developers made that made King's Field 3 a much more enjoyable experience to me personally. I already talked about that in regards to the map design and its progression blocks that invisibly guide the player, and this is just another piece to the pile. Enemy scaling is pretty linear, with the occasional tough monster to prevent things from getting too easy, but not wildly inconsistent or suddenly amped up to 11 whenever you encounter a group of projectile enemies. I felt like I could actually take risks with resource management and not always needing to top my health off, fearing a random one-shot from an enemy hitting me 3 times at once. This is my favorite way of playing King's Field, where you stretch your health and resources to the absolute limit and push through to reach the next checkpoint, possibly risking your progress but reaping the time saved from not backtracking to safety. King's Field 3 allows you to take risks and teeter on the edge of death while exploring, because the devs recognize that being hit 3 frames in a row is kind of ludicrous and impossible to manage. Therefore, enemies are on an equal playing field as the player, making combat not only more consistent but actually enjoyable. This is a bit of a return to form for King's Field 3, since the first game allowed this same risky playstyle. King's Field 2 also made Alexander less tanky, with his endgame health reaching roughly 250, but Lyle once again easily reaches beyond 300 HP, past the mid-game just like his father. What I gather from all this is that the development team wanted to take a lot of risks with King's Field 2, and I can respect that despite the flaws it brought, but afterwards they took a step back and realized that things were amped up too far in some directions, making the game harder than they intended. I say that with somewhat confidence because they backpedaled on a lot of the combat changes, like enemies being able to hit you multiple times in a second, rangers shooting long streams of multiple projectiles, fast enemy attack speed, lower max health or defense, but still maintained others that actually worked. Take for instance, the tougher magical enemies still have projectile tracking, or a relatively subtle feature that served to make combat more tedious. One that I barely mentioned because I thought it was a glitch in King's Field 2. After depleting your stamina, it takes longer to recharge, varying between roughly 3 to 8 seconds. It's usually noticeable upon initiating combat after sprinting, which is why it mostly served to make combat more tedious because it just delays you starting the fight. This was actually kept in King's Field 3. In fact, they turned it into a full-blown mechanic and offer you the godly Fujin boots that completely negate this stamina recharge delay, adding some more depth instead of outright removing the mechanic when they realized it didn't land right in King's Field 2. There is also a seriously brutal endgame area and final boss, so FromSoftware didn't just remove difficulty in King's Field 3, rather just properly balanced the game to where enemies are either in line or slightly above the player's power level with the experience and hindsight that King's Field 2 provided. Oh boy, remember when this was a King's Field 3 review and not an indirect apology for the King's Field 2 video? I sure don't. The Wind Temple ends rather swiftly, and in an appropriately regal chamber. The blessing of wind is bestowed upon Lyle Forrester. All that remains is the town of Ralugo, as the imposture has allowed us passage through the path of poison, although he still doesn't like us. This is the clearest path forward, and you are totally not missing anything crucial progression-wise, because the game wouldn't let you do that. Don't worry about it. Stop thinking about it. Stop overthinking. What's wrong with you? This cavern, as Schizo Lyle states, was secretly a warehouse for the Light family, yet another King's Field 1 reference surfacing in this game, which makes sense given this is Verdite after all. housing the Light family of merchants even in the first layer of the Royal Cemetary, linking them to the Reinhardt royal family and somewhat substantiating the claims of corruption and royal favoritism that pervades around the family. In Kingsfield 1, we can use the Light family key to open a secret chamber and steal one of their precious items. In Kingsfield 3, we have the chance to plunder an entire hall of treasures, including Aquarian boots, which will be essential for progressing in the next area. In these poison-infested sewers, we also find many slimes which mysteriously unpoison you? Thanks, dude. This was a mechanic in Kingsfield 2 as well, and a weird subversion of tropes or expectations, especially for a hostile enemy in a poison area. Sure, I didn't expect the slimes to poison you more, but I didn't expect them to be such chill little guys that give you a hug to suck the poison right out. This is, as far as I know, the only instance in both games of enemies actually helping the player, and I personally find that very interesting. I would have loved to see another friendly monster creature, maybe one that doesn't outright attack the player in one of these games, but at least I can consider the slimes a friend and not have to kill them. The Aquarian boots, circa 35 seconds ago, are used to pass over water bridges in the very next area. A sage tells us nobody has ever returned from the poison caves we just popped out of, and we need to acquire these Aquarian boots. Yeah, way ahead of you. She guards a contraption that triggers different configuration of water bridges, which is the only direct puzzle in the game that doesn't require you to use items in the overworld or the typical mechanics that Kingsfield puzzles usually consist of. You do get taxed by an increasingly valuable item each time you enter the door, even if you do nothing to the dial, and the layout of the islands is intentionally confusing on the diagram to force the player to give at least a few items, but overall this can be solved very easily through guesswork or trial and error. I wanted to point this out because it's an example of From Software testing out new types of puzzles and having the player reshape the environment to progress, which was also present in the forest maze from shifting logs to open up new paths. It's nothing groundbreaking, but does add more variety to the world than just running through a whole bunch of static locations, not to mention the need to use your specific pair of boots in order to cross the bridges, which an attentive player could pay attention to in a later area and pick up a special weapon. Lal then receives the gift of water in what is arguably one of the prettiest rooms in the game, and one of my all-time favorite looking ones from all of Kingsfield. Just take a moment to appreciate this. From here on out is where the game starts to pick up the pace and become really enjoyable. Instead of progressing linearly, as the first quarter of the game has been, we are now offered a dungeon linking to 3 separate areas all at once, all of which are open to the player to explore mostly independently, 2 of which chain into further areas and eventually taper off and lead the player to Verdite Castle. This part of the game is where the player has the most agency and also some of the best areas in my opinion. The Passage of Thieves is an oppressive area with corridors of deadly traps designed to secure the treasures of merchants and mages of ages long past, rooms clustered with skeletons that can stunlock you in endless paralysis, or grungy homunculi that deal heavy physical and magic damage. These faceless flesh creatures are also one of the most unexpectedly strong monsters you'll fight at this stage of progression, but they are few enough in number to reasonably deal with. The visual design of the dungeon is nothing striking, but more so is the oppressive atmosphere it gives off. So far, this is the longest and most complex cave the player has explored so far, with no healing fountain remotely close and thinly spread save points. It feels like a proper risk to fully delve into, especially with the enemy's amped up strength. This place made me feel anxious, but in a good way. I was properly challenged in both combat and exploration by having to manage my resources while navigating an expansive crypt with the minimal verticality that Kingsfield 3 offers. The depressing town of Cason lies beyond the western tunnels, draped in an eerie crimson sky. This dreary village is amply oppressive to match the surrounding areas. Nearly all of its residents were killed or evacuated. One even remains petrified. This is Lord Varde, who was meant to defend the people when hell broke loose from Verdite Castle. However, he was forced to watch his friends and comrades die in his prison of stone for a decade. Cason starkly contrasts with the other 2 towns in the game that were relatively peaceful and nice to be in. Save for the average monsters dotted around, there were still townsfolk living with resolve. However, this place consists of many ghosts that further darken your vision and turn this place into a true hell. On top of the depressing overtones of the environment and story, Cason Cason was not as lucky as Quist or Ralugo. Being only slightly closer to the heart of chaos led it to be destroyed almost in its entirety. The closer we get to Verdite Castle, the sparser life becomes. This town reminds me heavily of the disparaged settlements of Kingsfield 2, although with much more flavor due to its reddish skybox and varied environmental design. On Melonot, the small pockets where people lived always had this very out-of-place wall tile texture that felt really dissonant with the rest of Kingsfield 2's environmental design. It was hard to feel like you were in a hopeless town where people hated their lives when bright ceramic tiles beamed into your eyes like a vibrant cherry city under the sun. The bright skybox in some places, while serving a plot purpose, did even more damage to selling that vibe. However, Kingsfield 3 gives each town its distinct design and layout, Cason in particular with the harshest atmosphere. This area is not only the largest settlement, but the most hostilely designed one, with its dead ends, tight corners, oppressive darkness that makes the area feel larger and more anxiety-inducing to explore, and of course the dense hordes of enemies roaming across the vacant fields. As I already mentioned, Cason is highly populated by mainly ghosts, all of which either throw cursed skulls or voids of darkness from surprisingly far away. Darkness is a debilitating debuff in this game. It's good that Lyle automatically starts off with Cast Light because without it, this place would quickly drain every consumable and ounce of patience the player might have, while getting barraged from all fronts by near blindness that lasts for 3 minutes. Darkness means darkness in Kingsfield 3. You won't be able to see more than a foot in front of you, and even with a light spell, it makes your vision noticeably darker. Debuffs last quite a long time in comparison to previous games, making them far more annoying but actually effective as debuffs until late game armor allows you to recover faster. Eventually, we run into a woman deep in the town that gives us an Orladin's pick, intended to unpetrify Lord Varde. Alternatively, you could use it on the hostile plant creature that would disrespect the notion of saving it by still immediately attacking you, because that's funny. Regardless of your choice, there are more Orladin's picks available in the world. Choosing to save Varde gives an unexpectedly good ending for its remaining residents. Varde is able to defend the town, and the ghosts stop respawning, so it becomes a rather pleasant place to be in. The two sisters, still living there, also remain alive. I expected the sister who ventured for the pick to get killed, but this is a rather wholesome outcome for the dark world of Kingsfield. Varde is also the only NPC who can teach you the first stage of sword magic, something I didn't even realize until the end of the game because I thought it worked like the previous two. But there's a mandatory prerequisite of talking to an arbitrary NPC once you meet the baseline requirements of 50 in each magic stat. To me, this is one of the worst design aspects of Kingsfield 3 that pops up in a few key places. Sometimes, to even progress the main story, you need to talk to a random NPC to spawn something in the world, or in this case, unlock sword magic that you otherwise did everything crucial to trigger, except know that you're actually supposed to talk to that specific NPC to progress when there are no signs indicating that whatsoever. Once you finish your business in Cason, you have absolutely no reason to come back to Lord Varde, unless you omnisciently knew he's the one guy that teaches you sword magic. He gives you the wings of Icarus, which serves as plot purpose, and doesn't even have dialogue like, "Come back later when you have more, magic," or anything to hint towards this purpose. Just good fucking luck finding it out, pal. This is a recurring theme with the issue where it could have just been solved with a single line of dialogue to not leave the player with zero knowledge of an NPC's purpose. It just baffles me how good the progression in Kingsfield 3 is and how well it prevents the player from getting lost while simultaneously having moments like this. Anyways, if you were to use the Orladin's pick on the plant statue, then you would unlock a further segment along this branch, but it's not necessary to explore at this moment, and I'd rather cover the rest of the player's options for now anyway. The second choice for the player is a condensed cave system containing 2 dwarves. One can craft highly defensive armor out of a rare material called Promeus, while the other sells keys and Orladin's picks to you. This area is self-contained and rather unnoteworthy, which leaves the last remaining branch for the High Elf Ruins. This is one of my favorite areas in the game because it has unique environmental obstacles and puzzles you have to solve to actually progress, one of which requires the key of Icarus we have yet to build, but the game makes this very clear by the unusable pillars dotted around the valley that hint towards there being more to the area and giving us a reason to come back later. The other main obstacles are rock turtles that can only be damaged from the front. One you can shoot, but the other requires you to be bold enough to run off a cliff and platform without any jump button. I think this is great area design for a Kingsfield game that utilizes movement mechanics that don't often get showcased. The lack of bridges make the the area overall more harrowing to navigate, while the high verticality of the cliffs make the solution intuitive for the player to be able to easily figure out while still feeling satisfied. The rock turtles are also a well-designed obstacle because the mechanic is fluid enough to allow the player to take them down in different ways. One I believe requires a bow and arrow, but the other one I had to platform to take down up close could have reasonably been shot from a distance as well as possibly hit from behind with a spell. I just never tested those myself. My point is the environmental puzzle doesn't rely on one particular solution or item and is open-ended enough to allow the player to experiment their own way of solving it, which is far more fun than just using a very specific key in the right place or talking to a particular NPC that, I don't know, spawns a bridge for instance, but that's utterly ridiculous. They wouldn't put that in the game. It's rare to see these open-ended obstacles, or at least ones that actually feel substantial enough to dictate how you explore the area. Oftentimes, the Verdite Trilogy resorts to using key items on specific things, but I feel like the ones that allow the player freedom to create their own solutions are really the best for a game series like Kingsfield that's already very player-driven. As I've said though, these ruins do require a specific key item, but this time it serves plot significance and progression blocking, so it's more acceptable this time. What we're left with is the petrified plant statue in Cason, which we conveniently have a teleport directly next to, thanks to Lord Varde. Here we meet Lyn once again, who is now revealed to be a childhood friend of Lyle. Of course, he would have known this, but up until this point, the player had no idea who she really was. Lyn recounts a ring given to her by Alexander that would supposedly call upon him at the Dragon Fountain, which the player should keep in mind for later. She also flirts with us a little bit and gives us a key to her house so we could, you know, steal her possessions. Hell yeah! Upon returning to the inn, Lyn is gone with a note left on the table that tells Lyle she's going to look for her father. Picking up this note triggers a button to be revealed that opens up
The ominous skull that always watches from the east cliff of the building.
This is another instance of Kingsfield 3 forcing the player to interact with something unrelated to the area they need to progress to, but this one is far more intuitive because there's more of a reason to go back to Lyn than a random NPC. The button doesn't show without triggering this event though, which is still a bit annoying. While playing, I checked the wall and figured I needed an actual key to open the giant foreboding skull door, so for a little while after reading Lyn's note I checked everywhere else before stumbling upon the actual way I needed to go. Thankfully, there is a piece of rubble that sticks out to draw attention to the newly revealed button, which greatly helps a scrambling player find where they need to go, saving this from being that bad of a scenario in comparison to others. The skull door leads to an isolated snowy canyon where we eventually meet up with Lyn and... oh. Well, grave robbing isn't out of fashion yet. Lyn gave her life to deliver us the last seal of Icarus, so we should honor that by taking her prized possession, obviously. With crown in hand, Lyle can be teleported to the outskirts of Verdite Castle. The doors remain inaccessible for now, and his first priority should be restoring the seal. Quist is quite far away and not easily accessible from any fast travel fountain, so the best way to get there quickly is... a long-standing staple of Kingsfield that's no different here, holding a dragon tree seed allows the player to be revived upon death and respawn right at the town of beginning. Without fast travel, this would be about as brutal and time-wasting as dying, but thankfully this is a forgiving safety net for careless players who would prefer not to reload after every death. And for those with an abundance of tree seed where death is but a joke, this acts as a convenient, albeit painful, method of fast travel. Leon is the only person alive who can craft the key, therefore we need to hand him all 3 seals and our fully leveled X-Selector and wait for him to work his magic. In real time. There isn't much to do in this small stretch of time other than tie up some loose ends, catch up with some NPCs, or figure out where to go next if there's anything crucial you've missed so far. Hidden very close to the start of the game is one of the most iconic swords of the series, the Triple Fang, although you still need the Royal Key, which is itself hidden in one of the worst dungeons in the series. After the arbitrary wait, Leon disappears while leaving behind the Key of Icarus, and an X-Selector now drained of its energy and reset to its base level. At first this might be disappointing for X-Selector users, but at this point in the game, the player has picked up multiple strength buffs and gauntlets that further increase weapon damage, leaving the short sword a very swift and still strong blade. However, you've also had the opportunity to pick up multiple other powerful and unique weapons, and this gives the player the chance to experiment. Leon gives us a cryptic note which tells us to solve the puzzle of Icarus to obtain the power of the king, and this leads us back to the High Elf ruins. It's worth it to fuse the individual pieces together as soon as possible because it consolidates the previous 3 fast travel points points, while also allowing you to teleport to any fountain in the overworld, essentially giving you quick and easy access to almost every individual area, which makes the eastern edge of the map much more easy to access. Inserting the Key of Icarus into the suspiciously Key of Icarus-shaped hole allows us to actually pass through the stone archways, which more importantly leads to the maze temple of Orladin. This is another one of my favorite areas, being one of the lengthiest single dungeons in the game and one that really forces the player to stretch out their resources and take risks with its lack of shortcuts or many save points. On the first level, the player is forced to gather Orladin's keys in order to access the northern section, while in the east the player needs to navigate through precarious tunnels infested with the creepiest enemy in the series thus far, a door mimic that completely blocks the path and either shoots projectiles or shoves you out of the way. I absolutely love this design, and it's completely out of nowhere for a game with relatively normal enemy designs to have something this unsettling. The northern settlement largely consists of treasure and continues the creepy enemy design trend with a bloody skull pendulum. A portal to the lower floor resides behind the final locked door, descending the player into the real gauntlet of Orladin's maze. In order to progress, Lyle must traverse across broken bridges atop insecure spike pits while being shot at by questionably hot spiders. I mean, the fire part. You can actually walk across the beams on these bridges, but it's very sketchy every time. Further chambers consist of more broken bridges over certain depth and tunnels flowing with lava that need to be deactivated while simultaneously being, again, target practice for infinitely respawning spider women. This gauntlet will surely drain your resources and might force you to use more precious consumables past the replenishable golden fountain potions. Dying here will also set you back the entire way, as there's no save point along this half of the dungeon. It's a grueling 20-ish minute delve that's designed to constantly chip away at your health and mana, leaving you with nothing but a locked chest at the end of the linear gauntlet that you better have the key for. Otherwise, you'll need to go all the way back and do it again. The chests placed along the path don't have very good items in them, and Orladin's pick that's utterly useless as far as I can tell because you don't get petrified in this game, and there's other ways of curing paralysis, or light crystals that aren't entirely necessary. These might be placed here in order to get the player to waste their keys early, thus serving as more obstacles to keep the player away from the real treasure in a cruel twist of expectations. The treasure itself is an inconspicuous skull that's absolutely essential to place on the sassy skeleton posing on his throne in the eastern part of the maze. That single linear pathway takes up the entire half of the lower level, which goes to show how long it can be. The rest of the temple is much more relaxed, save for the room where you have 7 stone wall faces bombarding you with light needles, guarding a fairy fossil that's another obscure but crucial item for later. But back to the cunty skeleton, this fella is actually the great archmage Orladin. He resides here and waits for the savior of Verdite, guarding the last gate meant only for the destined Prince Lyle to pass. You can actually talk to his soul after placing the skull, where Orladin tells of his anxieties being the disciple of Icarus, how he essentially had no life of his own, no purpose other than to wait for Lyle to arrive, resigned to being merely a messenger for Vallad, the god, and thus he ceased to live. Quite another sad tale. However, directly afterwards we can speak to Vallad himself, the major god residing over Verdite who created Seath and Gyra, and possibly lesser deities like the Dragon of the Forest. Vallad recounts the ancient history of Verdite, how Seath and Gyra were created to quell the conflict between humans, elves, and dwarfs, but soon began to fight each other and caused even greater trouble for the land. Vallad then blessed Icarus to deliver his powers unto someone capable of defeating both of the raging gods, which happens to be Lyle Forrester for Seath, as Alexander already defeated Gyra 10 years ago. He then hands us the incredibly powerful Icarus armor set and returns to slumber. I enjoyed this moment more than talking to Seath in King's Shield 2, which is already interesting in itself, but Vallad offers more lore-filled dialogue and also doesn't feel like a malicious god with their own hidden agenda trying to get you to do its bidding. From the very beginning, Vallad has been helping us fix the world in ways we couldn't even realize. The save points, the trees that respawn Lyle at Quist, those are all physical manifestations of Vallad if this encounter is indicative of his true form. Not to mention the plan set in motion decades ago to culminate into this one moment of Vallad bestowing upon Lyle the rest of his power. It's a very satisfying plot point to amp up the player for the final arc. Returning to the Hill of Prayer, it's more of a transitioning area that leads to Verdite Castle, houses the broken Moonlight sword beyond a magical barrier, and a grieving woman mourning her trapped husband locked within the castle walls, who said she hid away a crucial key in the graveyard. This key, you guessed it, only spawns once you talk to her, naturally. So if you were to walk behind the fountain the second you got to the hill and come upon this suspiciously empty grove and find it to be, well, empty, You wouldn't really go there again unless scanning the entire graveyard, only to realize a massive conspicuous grave just so happened to get erected the moment you talk to a woman. I emphasize this because it houses one of the 4 keys that are all technically required within Verdite Castle to beat the game. Naturally, you'd stumble upon this location of the grave before the NPC, so why on Vallad's green earth would they compose the scenario like this? It's a tombstone! She didn't build it in 3 seconds! I say these keys are technically required because while you usually need all 4 of them to pass 2 doors into deeper parts of Verdite Castle, there is a very subtle hidden wall that leads behind one of those doors, leaving the player some wiggle room with only having found 2 of the keys. They'd have to know of the hidden wall in the first place, but it beats a soft lock. Speaking of soft locks, well, wait, why can't I get into Verdite Castle? Oh boy, I hope you really enjoy listening to me endlessly bitch because you're in for one hell of a treat. Put yourself in this situation. You've fully cleared every area in Kingsfield 3 you've come across to the best of your ability. After hours of clearing up every loose end you could possibly think of and bashing your head against every brick wall no matter the height, to the point where you think maybe you have to burn trees or jump off ledges for the faint glimmer of hope in the form of a key item to no avail. The game has let you progress all the way up until this point, and yet nothing in your immediate vicinity will be able to help you now. No. Now, you have to find the single crucial thing you missed in the entire unlocked world of Verdite. That could boil all the way down to not finding the right key behind a hidden wall at the very start of the game, or not talking to a certain inconsequential NPC that had no noteworthy dialogue or significance to the plot whatsoever. Hey, wait a minute. Oh, wrong guy. Sorry, wrong house. Man, it's almost like this is a severely flawed system, and putting this much weight on a single NPC to do an essential world action while the rest of the game they're utterly worthless is... You! What is it, boss? Don't give me that. 20 hours ago you told me to piss off if I wasn't gonna help anybody, but you didn't mention a single detail on how you were gonna help me. Well, I was actually getting to that part, boss. I actually just put a bridge up 2 seconds ago as you were busting down my door, but you don't gotta get all antsy about it, pal. I did you a big favor. So... Fireball! You would have thought that with all of Kingsfield 3's great progression blocking, it would never have allowed you to miss something so severe, so crucial within the first 6 hours of the game. Sure, this ominous cave past the fountain I frequently teleported to did tease me quite often, but I thought at least if it was an area necessary for progression, then I wouldn't have been able to pass it up so easily. I even tried destroying the trees or jumping off the cliff above, to no avail. The only solution to accessing this essential cave is talking to this random guy food maxing in his house, who, as I hinted at, doesn't even mention a single thing about building a bridge or helping us before curing the sick child. The only time we'll ever talk to him. I have to apologize again to John Kingsfield 2. The Skull Key incident is a drop in the water of the torrential fuck-up created by this one instance. A blunder so monumental that I have to turn back to the game I enjoyed so much that I praised for its good progression in utter disbelief, and ask, why didn't you just spawn the fucking bridge there in the first place? Under no circumstances would I have figured out that I need to talk to Brett and Joy or Andy to access this massively important ancient earthen cave, especially after being allowed to progress through 90% of the entire game. Not only is this a complete outlier of how Kingsfield 3 handles progression, but it makes realizing what you missed even harder when the entire world is open up to you by the time you actually need it. Again, Kingsfield 3 usually clearly gates off parts of areas that you need some key item or ability for, which makes it obvious to the player where they need to venture next or gives them a place to check whenever they get lost. This, however, is gated by absolutely nothing other than clearing a quest for an entirely unrelated purpose. There is no clear indication that this is a required area due to the consistent design of Kingsfield 3, and yet they expect you to talk to an absolute nobody or divine the secret implication that there's actually something hugely important hidden in Ralugo, even though both of the other clearly obvious roadblocks have been cleared. Not even Mark Johnson in his infinite wisdom could have predicted this horribly obfuscated dungeon, an intentional decision beyond comprehension of even Vallad himself. This is not an isolated incident, as I've covered the few other times where too much weight has been put on non-essential NPCs to progress the game, but this is by far the most severe. What is insane, and beyond even that, is how the game intentionally draws the player away away from this area by allowing them to proceed without knowledge of its existence. Forget why didn't they put a bridge there, why did they even move Impostor Lyle out of the way to allow the player to be stuck at the gates of Verdite in the first place? I had withheld this information for about 10 pages of script because this is how I experienced the game. Some player may have talked to Bread Guy on a whim and found the bridge with no issue and think I'm some unhinged maniac for spending 5 minutes complaining about it. While that last part is true, I feel like I was being pretty thorough in my time with Kingsfield 3. My prior experience with the rest of the series led me to not get stuck for more than 5 to 10 minutes at any given time, if at all. I knew something was up here, but I couldn't place what I was actually missing. My theories were way above what the game had designed, a hidden bridge or a secret tunnel within a late game area, things far beyond the simplicity of talking to an NPC. But as I've drilled into your skull time and time again, it's so obvious that it's had an integer overflow and wrapped all the way around to being impossible to fucking find. I also waited until this moment to really drive home how serious this issue is for Kingsfield 3, albeit an isolated incident. I genuinely believe that without searching through old walkthroughs and accidentally stumbling upon it, that I wouldn't have figured out how to access the earthen caves, all from missing one simple thing. That shouldn't be possible in Kingsfield, or at least as easy as it was to completely fly over my head. But that's enough bitching about this one segment. I'm sure the developers had intentions, maybe not good intentions, but this was a clear design choice that ended up backfiring, at least for me, and I bet other explorers going through the game blind. It doesn't ruin Kingsfield 3, unlike the compounding issues of Kingsfield 2 that put a sour taste in my mouth. This was just one big oopsie daisy. A jumbo-wumbo mistake smudged on an otherwise great game. The Earth Cave itself is, well, nothing compared to its build-up. At the early stage of the game, it would throw some new things to the player, like a tough Prometheus golem and some precarious platforming across bottomless pits, but it's nothing new I haven't discussed already. I think it's on the better side of dungeons, and definitely stands out from other bland areas around its intended part of the game, but it also doesn't stick out in my mind as anything special. Keep in mind, this was also my lowest point in Kingsfield 3, the crashing cataclysm after a slowly growing sense of minor mistakes or missed items, that further kicked off the realization that I've missed multiple keys, many secret weapons, and sword magic to top it all off. Needless to say, I was not having a great time. That time was made even worse by the final area before Verdite Castle, aptly named the Passage of Death. The difference here being this dungeon was made intentionally brutal, obtuse, and unforgiving. Despite all of my rage, I can respect the Corridor of Kill for its unabashed spitefulness toward the player. It essentially clocks the player with the strongest sucker punch the instant you walk into the doorway. A massive spike in difficulty in environmental traps that force the player to be careful and feel fear. This dungeon was designed to be as uncomfortable to be in as possible, all the way down to its veiny flesh walls and rusted buzzsaws that give me fear and hunger flashbacks. While earlier dungeons strained the player's resources through attrition, a single wrong step within these intestine tunnels could mean instant death. This place is absolutely littered with traps, from wall spears that deal over 100 damage in rapid succession, swinging maces that straight up one-shot the player, the aforementioned buzzsaws, and even harmless environmental traps just meant to fuck with you and impede your progress throughout the area. It also has the majority of hidden walls throughout the entire game, all condensed within a tiny rectangle that on the surface appears to be a single linear path but turns the map into spaghetti when fully explored. Thematically, this area and its hostile architecture fit really well into the narrative of Kingsfield 3. John Forrester had the foresight, as he was being slowly corrupted, to lock away all of the crucial artifacts and royal treasures that he could before it fully took him over. This kept his most powerful items out of the reach of his future transformed self, as no amount of soldiers set into this death trap would ever be able to retrieve anything noteworthy or even make it out alive. A majority of the chests within the crypt are either also empty, filled with bones, or useless junk just to further mess with the player, while also being justifiable by Forrester's motivations. Everything about this area revolves around the central idea of fucking with you, but in a very deliberate and organized way that saves it from being incredibly frustrating. Aha, you got me, Kingsfield 3, that's the third chest in a row with dusty bones in it. I probably have several diseases now. Don't forget the tetanus that bloodied wall spear already gave me. You silly rascal. It helps that even though this area was built to be as punishing as possible, it's very close by a save and restore point, and even has a save point within it and means of disabling most of the traps that one-shot you. The developers weren't monsters, so from all this, we get a very well-balanced yet highly dangerous area that gives the greatest challenge and exploration of the entirety of Kingsfield 3 and feels enjoyable while doing so. It is a highly anxiety-inducing area, but that makes every bit of progress made all the more satisfying. It's an area of slow methodical exploration and careful planning that's very befitting of King's Field, and a fortress that both Lyle and the player must conquer in order to become a true successor to King Alfred. Hidden deep within the halls of torment is this ever so crucial royal key, which took me an absurdly long time to find. It is very important for the future. Lyle can now grab the broken Moonlight sword from the Hill of Prayer and finally open the doors to Verdite Castle to put an end to this madness once and for all. Within the courtyard lies the Dragon Fountain, which must have been moved from the royal graveyard throughout the years. If the player remembers Lyn's ring, then they can use it at the fountain and call upon the ghost of Alexander Thronton Reginus of Granatki, the character we played as in King's Field 2. This is mostly a cool callback, but Alexander does also teach us the second level of sword magic, which is required to fully utilize weapons like the Moonlight sword. Veering off to the left of the courtyard is a suspiciously familiar large door that leads to a hall of torch scones and a teleporter. This is indeed the classic Royal Cemetary of old, still residing next to Castle Verdite. This is a brilliant moment with a faithful yet remixed versions of the first floor of the royal graveyard all the way from King's Field 1, and is not only an amazing homage but also a testament to how far the developers of the series have come only over a short few years. While it's not the entire map of King's Field 1 crammed into the game, everything looks and runs better despite King's Field 3 still being on the same system. The devs went as far as to recreate some of the unique enemies from the first game that are only present within this small recreation of the royal graveyard. The mummies mirror the placement from King's Field 1, the Wind Knights from the lower floors dot the crypt even though they're technically not supposed to be there. Hell, the skeletons at the very beginning behind a hidden wall are still there. The chest even has the same starting wooden shield as if preserved and unfound by John Forrester. There are layout changes that cut off the upper winding dungeon to the first floor, and a completely removed portal that cuts off access to floor 2 and below. But a lot of these inaccessible areas would serve little purpose other than to rehash the first game with no actual payoff. The disrepair of the cemetery is also relevant as to why many floors are inaccessible. I can only assume that Forrester's lineage locked it off to avoid more monsters getting out, or due to a lack of necessity or desire to continue using it. I do wish that the royal graveyard was fully fleshed out, but that would have taken a lot of unnecessary time and resources. What is present is a very soulful reincarnation of the area decades later lore-wise. A full recreation would have only been warranted by having corrupted King Forrester residing within the bottom, which would have been very fitting for the series and a convenient way to link the events of the first game with the rest of the series, but unfortunately Forrester rules from the castle, and the purpose of this shambling graveyard lies elsewhere. That does beg the question of what happened to the last King Reinhardt in King's Field 1. Now that we have the consistency of gods corrupting kings, then we can assume something similar happened in that situation. Gyra took over Melinoth and in turn, Necron. It's highly hinted at that Seath is the one controlling John Forrester. He is the only remaining powerful god after all that Vallad insinuates we need to stop now that Gyra cannot keep him in equilibrium. Perhaps the old king of Verdite was similarly overtaken by Seath, and that curse is just transferred onto John Forrester as the unlucky new king. This is corroborated by a resurrected knight of Seath, Merrill who wanders the derelict halls of the graveyard and attempts to stop her expedition. There is one NPC remaining from the old days, which was the first merchant you came across, who is now a shambling corpse rasping about Seath's will keeping him alive. Killing grants Seath's sword from King's Field 2, which still has the absolutely broken invincibility move. However, we can't humiliate Necron with it again, but you'll see its uses later. Merrill was also guarding the last remaining teleport pad that leads the player all the way down to the 5th floor, however only comprised of the same tactical nuke demons for now. We can also see the exact place John Forrester felled the former king of Verdite, however we can't get to the other side just yet. I seriously love seeing the return of the royal graveyard in King's Field 3. I was so full of joy and have had rarely such a surprising callback in a game that clicked with me this well. It feels like the developers poured their heart into making this game the culmination of King's Field, and it's a great reference point to show how far the story and player have come over the course of the Verdite Trilogy. I have a feeling FromSoft was intending to end the King's Field series with this entry. Obviously that didn't completely happen with the release of the Ancient City 5 years later, but with how well King's Field 3 has wrapped up the story and refined its design up till this point, it feels like it was meant to be the last hurrah for the series that might never have had another release. Verdite Castle itself is a big, oppressive, but rather simple area that is actually a bit tedious to explore due to its overly long corridors. I get that the designers were actually trying to sell the scale of the castle as an imposing area, but it ends up being needlessly large when it could have been a far better player experience by not forcing them to run back and forth down long, L-shaped corridors with nothing in them for 30 seconds at a time. This is the first time in Kingsfield 3, other than for loading zones, that the player has had to run and backtrack through long, empty hallways that had nothing but to pad the area. It's not a huge deal, but it does show a sign that Verdite Castle may have been a bit rushed. It doesn't feel adequately long or challenging for the build up to this point, but that's not to say it's an absolutely horrible area. It has one of the creepiest enemy designs I've ever seen. Dear God! Much like those fake door masks, Kingsfield 3 has the odd tendency to make me feel primal fear and uncanniness far removed from the cutely designed slimes or centipedes. Verdite Castle is hell. There are also interestingly modeled dragons that are reminiscent of Kingsfield 2 enemies that, along with all the other monsters, make Verdite Castle feel diverse and interesting from a combat perspective. There really is not much to say about this area other than you grab the important keys, save a guy behind an obvious Minecraft hidden base painting, eventually make it up to the second floor where you run through another series of long, arduous corridors, and then finally face off against John Alfred Forrester. However, if you were to fight him now without the restored Moonlight sword, Lyle would end up befalling the same fate by merely killing the vessel with which Seath corrupts, leaving him as the next candidate and almost immediately cursing Verdite to eternal despair. There's also a funny cutscene that shows the king blasting Lyle with a Darkslayer, which I was half expecting to fade out into a death screen, another possibly fitting end for Lyle if he came ill-prepared. So regardless of this fight, we need to backtrack and run through the needlessly long walls of Verdite Castle once again. Obtaining the special Phantom Crown preceding the King's Throne Room, we can then consult with Mark Johnson. Haha, yeah buddy, this is just a gag item Orladin used to prank fairies back in the day, trapping their souls forever in torment inside this inanimate object. What a jokester. It reveals a secret entrance too. Nah, I'm just pulling your leg. It drains your health, idiot. Thanks. Perhaps with the culmination of our rarest items acquired from the most rigorous and challenging exploration we could experience, dredging through the Passage of Death to obtain the royal key necessary for the Phantom Crown, being pelted by constant projectiles in Orladin's Maze Temple to retrieve the last remaining fairy fossil, and of course the broken Moonlight sword, it is finally time to revisit the depths of the ancient Royal Cemetery. Lyle appears to be teleported into the very heart of Verdite. Is this a god? Vallad? The dragon of the forest merged with the earth after fulfilling its mission in Kingsfield 1? Or a primal force beyond our comprehension that only facilitates the resurrection of the land's most valuable artifact? I would like to imagine that this is the new form that the lesser god of Verdite, the dragon of the forest, has taken over the decades since, but there is nothing concrete in-game that leads to any definitive answer. Perhaps this is even the force that corrupted Prince Reinhardt in Kingsfield 1, who is merely a benevolent natural force with no motive, thus simultaneously pumping out demons within the royal catacombs, yet aiding Lyle in stopping Seath's reign of terror. Regardless of what it is, it has allowed us to properly defeat King John Alfred Forrester in a pretty cool fight conceptually, as John wields the Darkslayer, an iconic sword from the second game, and of course the fact that we're facing off against the protagonist from Kingsfield 1, there's not really anything interesting about this fight mechanically. The scenario gets even sadder when Lyle slays the husk of John and his ghost arises from his body, finally free from the control of Seath and able to recognize his son and think clearly again. He thanks us and blesses the Moonlight sword into an admittedly overcomplicated design that makes it look kind of stupid. I mean, why does the crossguard have to be so large and spiky? That doesn't seem very practical. John then tells Lyle, "The end has not yet come. You must still destroy Seath so we can return peace and life to our beloved kingdom. I am proud of you, my son." I'm not crying. The comically large Moonlight sword is just poking my eye. Alright, Seath, you've really done it now. You've fucked with the wrong family line well known at this point for killing immutable gods. Prepare to beg for mercy at my signature weapon. Your own sword. Alright, Seath, come the fuck at me, pal. Yeah, you can't even touch me. I mean, just try to use a stupid fucking AoE move. That's right, you can't. Seath's sword is broken? That's the most fun part. That Seath is so pissed. Why won't you die? Why did I
designed this piece of shit to do this? What the fuck?
Yes, of course, it would not be a beautiful ending to Kingsfield in the Verdite Trilogy without absolutely humiliating the final boss through some busted mechanic. Like in Kingsfield 2, enemies can damage each other and in turn hurt themselves with attacks and explosive projectiles. This was quite common with how projectile-heavy Kingsfield 2 was, but isn't very frequent in 3, other than the final boss, that is. Yes, this is entirely possible and was by far the most entertaining way I could have killed Seath. It took probably 5 times as long and my fingers are starting to hurt, so it's arguably harder than just killing him normally. Both as a test of patience because self-damage is lower than normal, and a test of carpal tunnel. You also have to do specific movement in order to avoid the projectiles from either entirely missing Seath or just shooting on your back and not damaging the boss. Much more involved than Necron literally removing himself from existence if you were to just stand still for 10 minutes.
Maybe this will work. Maybe the Shadow Step will throw him off. God damn it, why is my sword so fucking invincible?
I think it's a beautifully poetic way to slay Seath with his own power, as he tried to ruin Verdite with the power of its own king, and Seath's arrogance and meddling with the affairs of mortals sealed his fate the second he decided to make a sword granting complete invulnerability.
Yes, yes, just keep doing that, please, keep doing that. Yes. I've perfectly manipulated your RNG so you will kill yourself within minutes. Your very life is at my hands, Seath. Feel fear. Feel what it's like to be immortal beneath a god. Bow before me, Seath, and my invincible sword. You can do nothing. God, that's taken a lot of fucking projectiles. I have manipulated you once again, Seath. There is nothing you can do. I control your every move. I know your every attack, and I can perfectly counter it with a single hold of a button. I told you it would work. Get fucked, Seath. I told you, Seath. You are a mere mortal bowing before a god.
After all this, the cursed walls surrounding Verdite Castle crumble, the demons and skeletons crushed and purified under the newly bright shining holy light emanating from Lyle. He stands exhausted on the cresting hill of Verdite Castle, in a deep melancholic contemplation of the loss of his family, his friends, and many denizens of the kingdom before him. However, Vallad in his final moments grants his blessing upon Lyle and his reign as king, bestowing everlasting peace and light for the kingdom of Verdite, but most importantly, resurrecting his hot elf wife. And so closes the chapter of Kingsfield, and a major segment of FromSoftware's history with it. Yes, Shadow Tower still exists, as does other FromSoft field-likes in the preceding 5 years, but Kingsfield 3 feels like the definitive end to where it all began. It's a truly satisfying conclusion to the Verdite Trilogy, and feels like a turning point in early FromSoftware. Kingsfield 3 makes so many improvements on gameplay mechanics, optimization, visual quality, map design, and everything that I've already talked about, that it shows they started to get a good grasp on what they were doing. It's far from the end of the experimental phase of FromSoftware, as Armored Core, Shadow Tower, Echo Knight, and anything past the next 10 years are a testament to that, but Kingsfield 3 marks the end of the fledgling FromSoftware that made Kingsfield 1, a janky yet incredibly impressive game that feels almost like a tech demo at this point, who have now turned around and delivered a game of far greater scope and depth in just a few short years. There are things I haven't talked about in Kingsfield 3, but I've generally covered everything that stood out to me as unique and important enough to mention. Notably, I haven't mentioned the music at all, which, while good, is not really something that stood out to me in the cascade of other design improvements made in Kingsfield 3. Kingsfield 2 had already landed on the oppressive atmospheric music and impressive melodies, and its sequel expanded upon by adding more variety in instruments and tones. There are some great tracks in an early FromSoft perspective, but nothing I would outright listen to outside of the game. It's also been playing for the majority of the video, so I think that speaks for itself. I thought I should clarify its absence from the script though. This video has taken me an exceedingly long time to write considering how much I love this game. It's the first of the PS1 FromSoftware games that I fully enjoyed without any caveats like, well, Kingsfield 1 may be janky and lacking story, but it was the first entry in the series, or, Kingsfield 2 sucks. because it feels like a fully fleshed out game. Again, out of the fledgling era and into the developers being able to fully realize the scope of an idea now that they know what they're doing. I think that Kingsfield 3 is the first in the series so far that an outsider can fully enjoy on a surface level. Granted, they'd still have to be down with a PS1 game, but it's a very solid, standalone game that's only enhanced by its previous entries. I've wanted to do this game proper justice and present it in an interesting way like I did for Kingsfield 4, which is probably why it took me 3 weeks to write, and even then this video can't possibly replace the feeling of playing Kingsfield 3 for yourself. Although I have spoiled many of the story beats and secrets within Verdite, consider it a curated light guide to warn you of the dangers of not talking to Bridgeman until it's too late. Thank you very much for watching. Of course I will not be stopping at the end of Kingsfield, absolutely not. I'm going completely insane and covering at least 40% of From Software's library, but that's considering I'm not touching the 30% that is DS shovelware or defunct mobile games. I won't be talking about Kingsfield additionals for a while, and I can't guarantee them in the future since they don't grab me as much as the original series. I want to talk about From Software games in somewhat chronological order, and don't want to skip ahead to 2006 and give everybody whiplash. So while this is the end of Kingsfield for now, it is far from actually over with Shadow Tower, Eternal Ring, Shadow Tower Abyss, and maybe more Shadow Tower surprises not entirely related to From Software that still tie in with the genre. But that is as far ahead as I'll divulge for now. Thank you channel members Shavenger, Mega Roomba, and Zap. I'm sorry I couldn't find a natural place to put this in the video, and that this one took so damn long to make, but I hope this is adequate enough. Thank you for supporting me, and thank you everybody who has watched to the end of the video. I'm very grateful that some people enjoy my erratic ramblings, and I enjoy making these videos on old games, so I appreciate the audience it's found. Until next time, goodbye. This script also took me 3 hours to record, by the way, and it's going to be cut down to like... This script took me 3 hours